Welcome to this event, which is hosted, like I say, by Housmans Bookshop. So for those of you who've never been able to go in real life or don't know, Housmans is one of London's longest running and few remaining radical bookshops. So thank you so much for supporting this event tonight, even when our doors have to be closed under the circumstances. We really, really appreciate you spending your Friday night with us. We're still operating a limited mail order service while keeping our staff as safe as possible. So do please check out the website after the event to stock up on some essential lockdown reading. And some of that reading might be tonight's book. So tonight we're here to discuss a provocative and timely new book, Exploring Degrowth, which is out with our friends at Pluto. So a sense of urgency pervades global environmentalism, and the degrowth movement is bursting into the mainstream. As politicians and corporations obsess over growth objectives, the degrowth movement demands that we must slow down the economy by transforming our economies, our politics, and our cultures to live within the Earth's limits. And we're lucky enough to have both of the authors of this book here today. We've got Vincent Liegey. Please forgive my terrible pronunciation if that was terrible, Vincent, sorry. He's an engineer, an interdisciplinary researcher, and he's a spokesperson for the French Degrowth movement. And we have Anitra Nelson, who's an honorary principal fellow at the Melbourne Sustainable Society Institute at the University of Melbourne, Australia. We must all extend a special solidarity to you because it's about 6 o'clock in the morning where you are. So thank you so much for being with us today. Both have authored and edited previous books on tonight's subject, so do Google them afterwards and go back and find out all their amazing work on this. And tonight they're in conversation with Derek Wall. He's the author of numerous books on left and green politics, and he teaches political economy at Goldsmiths College, University of London. So before I hand over to the panel, just a couple of housekeeping things. Feel free to chat amongst yourselves in the chat box. But if you have a question for any of tonight's speakers, there is a specific bespoke Q&A box. So pop your questions in there. And if you see a question you like, you don't have to ask it again. You can upvote questions. So if you think someone's particularly interesting and you really want the panelists to check it out at the end, make sure you just upvote that. I think that is it, because we'll just have some questions at the end. So that's all the housekeeping. So please do now just join me in handing over to our guests and give them an eerily silent but very, 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 very warm virtual welcome. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Russell. For those of people who are just being introduced to degrowth, it's essentially about minimizing the materials and energy that we use, the amount of earth that we use in order for us to live. But just as importantly, our first principle of degrowth is minimizing inequality. So what I might do first off is to hand over to Vincent to speak a little bit about the background to degrowth.
Hi, hello everybody. Thanks, Anitra. Let's start with the question of inequality. And I think the growth model of society was very comfortable for the oligarchic system we've been living in for years, for capitalism. Because with growth, we could make the people accept the fact that we are rising inequalities in the society, because you always have the hope, always have the promise that sooner or later, you too, even if you are in terrible situation and so on, thanks to economic growth, you too, you will become rich. And it's been a very central pillar of the last decades of our economic development, where we could reach rising and even exponentially rising inequalities. And it's even worse and worse in the last year. The story is that no, there is no growth anymore in most of the European countries for maybe decades. And it's unlikely to go back to big economic growth that we experienced like in the 30 glorious years after the Second World War, as we call it in France. And I would even say, as degrowth is questioning, it's not desirable to keep running after economic growth. It's not desirable because infinite growth on a finite planet is physically, environmentally, energetically impossible. So now we have all the literature, all the feedback to understand something which is quite obvious. size of the planet is 40,000 kilometers, and even if we had a lot of economic growth in the last decade, the size of the planet is still 40,000 kilometer circumference. So whether we want to have always more growth, we have limitations because we live on a planet which is called the Earth, but we cannot grow forever. And in degrowth, where we scientifically, physically, energetically, environmentally, with a very hard science academic background, criticize physical limits to growth, we don't stop there. We also believe that even if infinite growth on a finite planet would be possible, it would be undesirable, or at least we should question whether it makes sense to live in this model of society. We started with inequalities, where you have always more growth to always have more inequalities, which create even more frustrations, rivalries, greed, violence, democratic imbalance, dominations, and so on. And also we should question whether this model of society organized around work with employment, where you go to make a bullshit job, if you are maybe lucky, or worse, you make a very hard work in precarity, or even worse, you work for a type of things which goes against your own values, where you work for the type of job which are more destructive for the well-being of the societies and helping the well-being of the society and so on. So we should question this society where you go to work to buy things what you don't really need, to earn more money, and you are like the hamster in the wheel. So degrowth is really bringing together the physical limits to growth and the cultural limits to growth. I would say the cultural and physical limits to this model of society, what we've been developing in the last decades or centuries, or in Western Europe, and try to extend all around the world under the name of development, to question whether it really makes sense. And we know that we are going to the wall. We know that we are now facing very frightening emergency challenges, climate change, biodiversity loss, and a lot of things like that. But we also know that we are not happy. We are far away from being as happy as a level of over-consuming and over-wasting what we do in our model of society. So we should make a step aside. We should decolonize our imaginary. In French, I could play with the word because décroissance, degrowth is close to décroire, which is debelieve. And degrowth is first an invitation to debelieve, to deconstruct a lot of what I would call toxic concepts, which are not questioned so much anymore in our model of society, which are, I think, toxic for our well-being, which are toxic to open our mind and to be able to understand the 21st century challenges and to be enabled to co-construct meaningful solutions based on new types of values. And degrowth is really oriented to transition, democratic, serene, decentralized, relocalized, open, in solidarity types of transitions, and I put it in plural on purpose, toward new models of society, also in plural, based on other types of values like open relocalization, like ecofeminism, like maybe eco-socialism, because here we have an expert of eco-socialism, like autonomy, like conviviality, like direct democracy, like low-tech, like permaculture, a lot of other types like care, like the commons. And it's really like to open these debates and to put together something which degrowth didn't invent, but degrowth rather went to pick it in history of the intellectual debates, in history of the political traditions of a lot of different types of movements, from anarchism to utopian socialism, for example, but also in traveling in other civilization who didn't make the type of mistake that the Western civilization is doing, not to say or romanticize other type of civilization, but to go to visit other culture helps you to understand much better your bias and your ethnocentrism and your culture and so on. So degrowth is really this invitation for debate, for deconstructing a lot of toxic concepts, for decolonizing our imaginary, and start to implement concretely, individually, collectively, politically, in resistance, also in intellectual and academic debates, start to construct new hope toward new models of society, what we need in emergency. We need to conceptualize it, we need to dream about it, we need new utopias, but we need to act and to do it here, right now, without minimizing the challenges and what are the blockage. what we face.
So I think it's probably quite important in the current climate where most economies are struggling under COVID-19 restrictions, to sort of point out too that one of the kind of calls of degrowth is your austerity is not our degrowth. So one of the things that we discuss in the book is the ways in which degrowth has often been misunderstood. So a lot of the ways that we first start talking about degrowth is actually to unpack that kind of prejudice, in a sense, that people come to the word with, which is a little bit unfortunate, but it actually does give us the opportunity to talk about why it's so important to live within Earth's limits, and especially if we're talking from the global north and particular sectors of the global north, that's an incredibly important way in which society needs to move forward.
I should move on. So I think now we are facing quite an interesting historic time. First, I really believe, and I don't speak only about the pandemic, I speak about a lot of convergence of challenges and problems. We are in the turning point of our Western civilization. And the key question is not whether we will have degrowth in the end of the century, but the key question is whether we go to degrowth in a non-violent way. And that's really the key challenge. And to do so, we should be able to put on the table the right question, to have meaningful debates. Not to address properly the problem is reinforcing the violence in the situation and so on. And one of the key questions, I mean, I will go back to what you started with as a question of inequalities, because degrowth is radically about sharing, is radically about questioning property rights, where property right is going against the interest of living together, of enjoyment of life, of social environmental justice, of sustainability, of meaningful life, meaningful activities, and so on. So inspired by that, degrowth tried to put together a lot of ideas, decreasing inequalities, providing to the people type of serenity and autonomy, which is, I think, also fundamental to have a democracy. You don't have proactive democracy or participatory democracy if the people live in fear, if the people live in economic fear, live in an unemployment fear, live in a constructive type of fear, like we are afraid of the refugee, we are afraid of the neighbors, we are afraid of the foreigners, and this type of things. So we put together a lot of ideas, and we ended up with a central proposal, which is the implementation for all of what we call unconditional autonomy allowance. And this unconditional autonomy allowance will be a bit like the unconditional basic income, but it's different because it's partially demonetarized or decommodified. So it's like the same principle. We say that in our rich world, we refuse to abandon anybody under a level of decency. So we provide from birth to death to all unconditionally. So not conditioned to any kind of employment or what, any kind of conditions and whatsoever, what we democratically consider as enough to have a decent life. And we put in the picture a debate about what are our basic needs. Are our basic needs the dream to go to travel in the space, to take an airplane every weekend, or our basic needs are something else? What really matters in our life? And we implement democratic debates about that. And this unconditional autonomy allowance is providing, or is proposing to provide to all, based on this public deliberation, all these basic needs. So it can go from a free access to a lot of resources which are necessary to have a decent life, like water, like energy, access to a type of services like public services, or funerals, fees, or public transport, and this type of things, health, education, to put together in the picture food, which could be provided with local or alternative types of currencies, like you redevelop locally food sovereignty around the alternative economic local systems, so you get your food through this system and so on. And the main idea with all this issue is really to make the democracy alive again. And in France, we just had this fantastic experimentation experience accepted by Macron to go out of the rising police repression violence against the Yellow Vest movement. We implemented a citizen convention for the climate. And 150 people were randomly chosen to question what to do in terms of social and environmental justice to address the climate challenges that we face. And they ended up with 150 proposals where you find a lot of things in line with what I've just spoken about before. And I think it's very inspiring to see that when you make democracy much more direct, deliberative, participative democracy, questioning the people, what really matters, what are our basic needs, and how do we fulfill these basic needs in a conscious way, in a sustainable way, in a fair way, in a transparent way, you end up with very interesting solutions. And a central proposal what we have in our book, and which is coming from the French Degrowth movement, is really this idea to, inspired by unconditional basic income, unconditional basic services, the common, alternative local economic system, how to provide from birth to death to all what is important to have a decent life, and also parallelly to that, to start to implement some limits with a maximum income and very radical debates on redistribution, distribution, how to question property right when property right is going against this goal to achieve social and environmental justice.
Derek, I was wondering if you've got something that you'd like to add at this stage.
I kind of done quite a bit of recent work with a guy called Michael Chant, who's a composer. And it's really got me thinking that I need to say a lot less. I mean, I think with these events, they're great, but it's always good to get the absolute maximum time for the participants to say their truths. I'll try and be brief. I'm not good at that, but I should really be brief. I mean, thank you so much for inviting me. You were kind of going to ask me about the UK. I think things are so terrible in the UK. I mean, if I'm serious, I mean, 120,000 of us died. It's the worst death rate in the world. We have a government which is corrupt. We have no political opposition. I mean, to be honest, we're being pretty much fucking ground into the ground, really. So I want to talk about that. But it's good to sort of maybe forget the UK at the moment. And I think really quite often we have people from the UK pontificating about politics and ecology. And unlike France, we're a country that hasn't had revolutions. We certainly need them. So yeah, absolutely agree on degrowth. We have the crisis of climate, manifest ecological crises. And it's like Egyptians building pyramids, that everything on a society is based around the pursuit of economic growth. But in countries, people are talking less about the deaths from COVID, but the damage to GDP. So we're in a whole society where the kind of secular religion is economic growth, and that distorts and corrupts everything. So degrowth is the very modest and essential demand that we don't just measure everything in terms of GDP and GNP. And we know that the kind of slogan, prosperity without growth, that we could make things last longer. We could have more social sharing, libraries, toy libraries, parks. There's all sorts of ways that we can become wealthier, even in a material way, without this kind of culture of produce, consume, throw away. So degrowth has got that kind of promise. And, the extent I do any academic work, it's around the commons and the work of Eleanor Ostrom, who was the first woman to win a Nobel Prize for economics, about how you can have collective ownership and property that works. But, I'm pretty much a Leninist, so it's like, how do we actually do things? How do we interact? how do we actually bring the kind of change? So I'm conscious that it's the 150th anniversary this year of the Paris Commune, and it's still too soon to actually assess what the Paris Commune achieved. But the Paris Commune, where the workers ruled democratically and produced their communal luxury and lived better, was violently destroyed. And the most important questions are around violence and strategy. So in Britain, we're dying. And who do I blame? I blame the Guardian newspaper. So we've got a supposedly liberal newspaper. They worked tirelessly to undermine an alternative. And what we have in Britain is, let's be frank, that if people come up with alternatives, talk about positive change, they're very, very heavily repressed. So people may know about the scandal of Spike Ops, where you had police agents infiltrating environmental movements, trying to stop destructive development. And then these spies would sleep with activists, father children. And we've actually, it disgusts me because I know him. Keir Starmer is the Labour leader, and he's actually supporting the government legalising this. So we're in to be frank, a terrible way. But, if I kind of put one person off here who's in the audience and reading The Guardian, I've done a small amount. So the big question, I think, both in Britain and right around the world, is strategy. How do we actually build our forces to make political change? So, for example, there's the Andreas Malm book, How to Blow Up a Pipeline. I don't know whether I'm quite agreeing with blowing up pipelines. I think he's kind of saying that to get us thinking, and it's a lot more than that. But there's questions around strategy, the fact that when you have alternatives that are good for humanity and the rest of nature, they do tend to get suppressed. So what's the kind of strategy? So one strategy I find very attractive, I'll try and bring this around to your wonderful book in a minute, is this kind of idea of base building. So I don't know whether people are familiar with base building, but it's the idea of building community, practical, militant, disciplined political organizations, because you can only change the world by mobilizing millions of people into practical action. And in the UK, it seems a little bit like every avenue has been shut down. So you had Jeremy Corbyn, he's been chucked out of the Labour Party for, if you look at the kind of revolutionary left, if they're anarchists or Trotskyists or Marxist-Leninists, they've got a tremendous critique of what's gone wrong with parliamentary politics, but they've not been able to mobilize change. So I'll tell you what I'm selling and then bring it back to the book. So what I'm basically selling is saying to people, read two things, take one action. So go online and read Carly Akuno's It's Eco-Socialism or Death. So Carly Akuno from Jackson, Mississippi, African-American revolutionary eco-socialism based on these kind of base-building strategies. So read that. I'd also say go and look at Philly Socialist site. So I think the most exciting political organization on the planet at the moment is Philly Socialist. It's Philadelphia. And they've got community gardens. They've got tenants unions. They're putting on English classes. They're doing like legal support. And they're, I think, the fastest growing and most militant political organization in North America. So this is this idea of militant, revolutionary community action. So basically in your community or where you work, find 3 or 4 friends, read about base building, build the base, serve the people. So that's my strategy to bring it back to the book rather than me just selling my dull truths. I noticed that you talk about the kind of snail strategy. Could you say more about that?
Before we do, I'd just like to say that I've co-edited 2 other books, and one's Housing for Degrowth, came out a couple of years ago, and just out, Food for Degrowth. And those are both collections by activist scholars talking exactly about what you're talking about, Derek. It's about people working on the ground in terms of cooperatives and collectives and doing things. And all of these things that they've been doing, they reflect on and show how it could be multiplied and grow up. What are the real challenges, but what are the real opportunities? And I couldn't agree with you more that, and degrowth is very much about being positive, collectively self-provisioning. This is a really, really key aspect of degrowth, which I think is one of the reasons why it's attracted so many younger people. But I might pass back the question about the snail to Vincent.
Yeah, it's in degrowth we have an approach. I mean, we've been going through a lot of debates, and there are still open debates, of course. But the type of approach what we put in the book, it's how to be radical without being an extremist. So how to take the problem from the roots and somehow assume that we are starting from where we start, being quite positive but not naive. Also understand while reading and understanding about the past, how we ended up here. So it's like to be a non-violent without being naive. To be non-violent in our approach, in our strategy, to try to impose the right questions, or to invite the people to question the things in a meaningful way, to be very determined to that, because degrowth is also about civil disobedience. It's about non-violent direct action. It's about, for example, what was in France one of the larger experimentation toward, I think, what is a model was a ZAD in Notre-Dame-des-Landes, next to Nantes in Western Europe, when they planned to construct a huge airport to compete with Heathrow. It was totally absurd. They wanted to construct in the middle of nowhere a huge airport, and for decades people have been fighting, and in particular in the last decades, where people were fighting against the airport, but mostly against his world, in the meaning is it's imaginary what is behind the airport, and they block and they self-organize themselves, surrounded by thousands of soldiers for years. They self-constructed an alternative, an utopia, self-organized small commune in the middle of nowhere. They started to make permaculture, to make eco-construction, to make a low-tech energy system, to create a local economic system, mostly based on reciprocity, and try to rethink democracy, the commons, share the land in a meaningful way, make permaculture, create their own markets, and so on. And they managed to do that. It was very incredible. Again, surrounded by thousands of soldiers who tried to attack them every day. And somehow they won a fight, and I think it's very inspiring. And they won a fight, but the war is not won. I mean, the war is far away from being won. And I think it's very important to connect social movements in resistance with local initiatives, like what you try to promote as an alternative to the dominant system. You already start to self-organize it in your territory, in connection with other people and so on. And how it's really in the heart of the degrowth political strategy. It's how to connect together different levels, different spheres, different strategies, which are, I really believe, complementaries with each other. How we can pick and find allies on different levels of the resistance and the implementation of the transition. And again, when I say that without being naive, like we can have cooperation with a transition tone movement, but also we will be highly critical to the limits of this movement. We can have cooperation with Extinction Rebellion, but the same, we will be highly critical. Or we have cooperation with a feminist movement of Black Lives Matters movement and so on, but we will also be critical and bring other perspectives, try to connect the dots with a lot of other issues, a lot of other questions, a lot of other groups, levels of actions, and so on. And I think that it's how to cultivate a type of diversity in a larger movement, in pushing for very radical questions and debates, but in a constructive way, toward more and more convergence. Also, I really believe that now we are facing more and more catastrophe, and we are all aware of the shock doctrine, what Naomi Klein developed. And in the last decades, unfortunately, each time there was a catastrophe whatsoever, like Katrina in New Orleans, like an economic crisis, like violently repressed revolution or movements and so on. At the end, the dominant system used it to even go further in the neoliberal criminal political agenda, in repressing always more the people and so on. But we can start to see what we in Degrowth speak about the pedagogy of the catastrophe, that a catastrophe could also be an opportunity toward an alternative model of society. And I really believe that what will make a situation turn into the shock doctrine or a pedagogical catastrophe and more autonomy or reappropriation of the debate and transition is the level of awareness where culturally the population before the catastrophe arrive. If the people don't understand and don't know anything about what's happening, why is it happening, what's behind and so on, it will be a shock doctrine. The dominant system will be happy to even impose you more their political agenda and create even more repression, inequalities and so on. But if the people are aware and understand what's behind, there is a bigger chance to use this period as an opportunity to implement something else. And we could observe that in the last 2 or 3 years with different type of catastrophes, events, movements, and so on. And it's never black and white. It's always a fight between different parts of the population, different interests, and so on. And I really believe that more than ever, we are back to something where we thought that it belonged to the past, which is the question of a war of the classes, which is a question that we have a oligarchy, which never been historically so rich, so powerful, military, institutionally, mediatically, also in having the tools to create the dominant narratives on everything. But on the contrary, I think we've never been in such a good position, and there are a lot of very interesting surveys, in particular, even in UK, which are totally different to the everyday life of what the people are experiencing. There are surveys showing that there is maybe a large majority of the people in our societies who would rather follow the principle what we put behind degrowth or eco-socialism or radical critiques to capitalism for a much more simple life, for much more solidarity, for much more low-tech, permaculture, better balance in our everyday life, working with our hand, our head, sharing, care, commons, and so on. Culturally, these ideas are much more present in the head of the people than what we think. So we are a bit in this turning point on how to transform the catastrophe, like the pandemic and the way the pandemic is mismanaged or used again as a shock doctrine to increase austerity, to increase inequalities, to increase repression and autocracies and so on. So we have cultural background to maybe implement something else. And again, when I say that, I try to be very positive without being naive, because I know that what we have to fight against is incredibly violent and well organized.
Derek, there's a question, a quick question for you on, you mentioned Philadelphia. I think it was Philly eco-socialists?
Philly socialists. So yeah, Philly socialists, just Google them. They're really great, I think.
Yeah, that was the...
And a lot of organised violence in the state in the US. So it's like building up your capacity and really strong networks of strong people in a practical way. You can resist violence and transform. But yeah, have a look at Philly Socialists, really good model.
Great. And there's another question. In England, I'm reading it out now, and it's from Penny Cole. In England, the government has issued guidelines to teachers that anti-capitalist materials should not be used in the classroom as they are extremist. Is it not time we as activists demand an anti-capitalist decolonised curriculum across all systems of education? And the simple answer is yes, But there's a longer answer to that. And it points out things like, I mean, this is just straight out repression, as a lot of the liberal democracies have been criticised in communist countries for ages. So there's no way that they can get away with saying that kind of thing. But there's another aspect of this. I was in a global eco-socialist network meeting recently where people were criticising degrowth, and they were actually misrepresenting degrowth as being not anti-capitalist, whereas actually degrowth is very much in a post-capitalist sort of paradigm. Right at the moment, I'm finishing a manuscript for Pluto that's called Beyond Money, a post-capitalist strategy. And I do think that it's actually really important for us to be anti-capitalist and say that there's something deeply wrong about this system, and we should be able to say so.
Do you want me to come back on any of that?
Yes.
Well, we remember, don't we, from, I mean, I would say yes, you know, we do need that curriculum, and we have a kind of joke government and a joke opposition, and voter suppression is going to come in. So there's going to be a big push for ID to make it more difficult for people to vote. And then there's redistricting. I mean, I don't know whether to cry or laugh when people talk about proportional representation. You know, so we've got a non-proportional system, but then there's the next 7 things coming in very fast to make Britain a lot less democratic. So of course, yes, we need a different curriculum, you know, that reflects diversity and looks at economic alternatives. But really, that's only going to come out of the quality of our resistance, isn't it? You know, we need to raise our resistance. And I'm certainly not going to disagree on capitalism. I mean, capitalism maybe in theory works, but in practice, hugely inefficient and oppressive. And always good to go back to Karl Marx, who examined this in such a prophetic way and said, accumulate is Moses and the prophet. So it's this constant cycle where you make money, you invest in capital, you make more money, and this goes on forever. And that distorts human life and ultimately destroys the basis of ecology. So certainly if I'm looking at scholars like Eleanor Ostrom, I think this is the first year I've not given an Eleanor Ostrom course because the auditors have been into Goldsmith closing down courses. But, you know, she won her Nobel Prize, and in many ways she kind of came from the right. She wasn't a Marxist or a Leninist like I am, but she was saying, you know, you can create economies that move beyond the market and the state and are efficient and so on. So, yeah, we've got to have a basic principle of being anti-capitalist. And if we're looking at thinkers like Ostrom, they're very nuts and bolts on how you can actually own things communally, make it work, promote cooperation. So, you know, it's all very well dreaming and being utopian. You've got to have good methods. So, yeah, I'm probably mainly trying to sell you, go and look at Philly Socialists, go and look at Carly Akuno's It's Eco-Socialism or Death, set up a base building group. But Ostrom is very good for nuts and bolts, how you bring about, how you actually have your sort of communism that works.
Vincent?
Yeah, in this dynamic, I think there is a very interesting level I've been involved in the last years around the municipalist movements all around Europe and also in US. There were interesting dynamics. I don't know if in Australia, in other continents there were as well, but I mostly followed the one in Europe. And it's also in the line of the commons. And I think the level of a municipality is a very interesting level to create movements which participate or influence the debate in the framework of municipal election, and also to bring new narratives and new practices in local democracies and other type of management or non-ownership of the commons in a city. And I am involved in such things here in Budapest, so doing it and following experiences like in Barcelona, in other cities. I think about Grenoble in France, for example, I spoke about it when I was in Manchester last year for the preparation of the upcoming International Degrowth Conference and so on. It's a very interesting lever because you easily connect the people. You easily have a territory where people are living, where people could address type of things which are important for their everyday life, and to make politics a bit in a step aside, far away from the party and the power games, which can kill all your energy or consume all your energy and end up only with the psychopaths still playing the game in that party game and so on. And the municipalist movement is a good level to start to experiment something and to do something. My second point, which is directly reflecting on that, and back to what I already mentioned before. Already years ago, I was saying in France that the transformation of civilization won't come from a type of organization we already know. They all failed, and they are all part of this system. I think about an union, I think about a political party, I think about a typical NGO and so on. I really believe, and I don't say that they are unnecessary, I think we still need them, and we still work with them and so on, but radical transformation will happen when you will have the emergence of type of new movements that we don't know how they would look like. And I think in the last year, we had this type of fantastic, interesting, spontaneous and large movement. I will, with all limitations and contradictions, I already spoken about them. Let's speak about Extinction Rebellion and maybe Youth for Climate March and so on. And in front, the Yellow Vest movements. And again, all these movements are full of contradictions and so on. But somehow they could create type of emulation and create debates, and also for the Yellow Vest movement, make a lot of lines politically move. Where in the beginning, when I think about the Yellow Vest movement in France, the unions were against it because they felt that their raison d'être has been stolen by a group of idiots who they didn't know who are these idiots, who don't understand anything and so on. And I really believe, and in Degrowth, we try to work a lot on that. I really believe that we need to be more creative than ever. We need to let space, to find spaces, to offer spaces for creativity and for experimenting new types of movement, new types of social interaction within these new types of movement and so on. And I see within the younger generations, a lot of appetites, a lot of enthusiasm about that. If you provide them, and it's what we do in our cooperative here in Budapest, in low scale, if you provide to a group of young people a space like the commons, but on the commons, when they will reappropriate, they will start to self-organize themselves in a way I wouldn't have done it 20 years ago when I was in the same age. And I really believe that we should, and it's back again to the commons, that should be one of the key points, to reappropriate spaces for experimenting alternative ways of life, alternative ways to construct a movement, alternative ways to resist, alternative ways to open debates, alternative ways to self-organize the economy or production or exchange or democracies or social interaction differently.
And there are many examples of people in the degrowth movement who are doing that kind of thing. If we look at places like Calafou or Can Masdeo in Catalonia, where people have been creating spaces which are like massive social centres and community gardens and makers cooperatives and all of that kind of thing. I might just jump to a question that Sarah has asked. She said, can anyone speak to the potential role or existing roles of social workers in the degrowth movement? And there, I think, because I worked at a university in a department where we taught community and social workers, and a lot of our curriculum was actually around helping people in terms of collective self-help, joining people with movements for housing, for creating easier ways for them to live, and So I actually think that depending on who you're working for in terms of social workers, if it's working for the state, there can be a lot of innovative programs that you can actually suggest within your organisation, not necessarily that they'll get up, but you can at least suggest those kinds of things. And you can also be offering clients different ways of actually meeting their needs. Derek or Vincent, do you have anything extra to add to that? Social workers is a very interesting, it's a very interesting term.
So yeah, maybe I move on quickly. I would say that from a degrowth perspective, we are all more than ever social workers, time to time in our everyday life, and it's really like how to rethink. How do we care about each other? How do we care about the society? How do we care about the environment around us and so on? And how do we co-construct all the time environments which are about well-being for all? And that's really the question of our social organizations nowadays. And I think we should really go out of this ideology of employment. And that's why degrowth is opening a lot of debates about unconditional basic income, and always to connect it with a democodification of our society, always connected with the commons, always connected with our radical critiques to capitalism and so on. So it's not a neoliberal political agenda of basic income driven by Zuckerberg or this type of guy. Like they believe, like with new technologies and robotization and high-tech 5G and so on, we will run out of jobs and we need to feed the people and so on. No, the unconditional basic income, what we are interested in, it's to rethink and to reappropriate autonomy and meaningful activities. Like I don't have to accept anymore to pay my bills, bullshit job in a corporation. I don't have to accept anymore to pay my bill to work for the military industrial complex or to work for the disgusting pharmaceutical companies as they work right now, or to accept to do my skill, to apply my skill for a boss, for a company, which is doing things which are going against my principle. But through a basic income, I can reappropriate my choices and to use my time, my energy, my enthusiasm, my skills, and to develop them, to emancipate myself from this employment, and to do it in a way that I would do it for my well-being and for the well-being of the people around me, and also in reflecting about how to do it in respecting the environment. And all the small-scale experimentation of unconditional basic income are showing that the people don't start to use the money what they will get to do bullshit, but on the contrary, to reappropriate autonomy. And as they have trust in themselves, they have economic serenity, they will use that time to do something meaningful for the well-being of the society and so on. And I think also when I was speaking about the younger generation, in particular in this frightening time of COVID and what they will have to face with climate change, with biodiversity loss, with a world which has never reached such high level of inequalities and the violence, what it creates, and it may create even more. We have a young generation of people who are, not all of them, of course, but I think quite aware of these challenges, who has an imaginary which has been constructed differently than ours because it was constructed through the social network. So they have a type of vision of the society which is much more horizontal than what we had, where we were educated in a much more vertical way to get the knowledge and to get the education and so on. But they don't have the economic capacity or the space to do it. And unconditional basic income are even better, with a part which is decommodified, that we propose for this younger generation, could be a great opportunity for them to go out of capitalism and to construct new types of political institutions based on other principles.
There's a question about trying to sort of shift people's mindsets towards a simpler life. The question being, some people have not much in their lives other than consumption, so that's a huge problem. I think one of the aspects of this question is to explain a little bit more, especially to eco-socialists who, again, I'm kind of like having a response to the meeting I was at, where there were attacks on degrowth for emphasising growth as being ideological, in inverted commas, when in fact it's material. And degrowth is actually very much accept that it's a material operating necessity of capitalism. But we do have a lot of emphasis on changing culture, because we know that this is a problem. This is a problem if your habitual everyday life is in capitalism, and very naturally, because it's all built around this, is to go out and your actual social contact is through shopping and all of that kind of thing. It does actually involve what we call kind of deconstructing people's imaginaries in order to move ahead. And of course, this has happened in the women's movement, Black Lives Matter movement. All movements are involved to some extent with deconstructing the deconstructing the kind of ways in which people have been normalized. We have things like talking about frugal abundance. We have got a whole lot of key little words that we kind of talk about that kind of like shift, in a sense. It's about shifting people's ways of looking at their experience.
So just, I move on quickly. It's very interesting because we have this feeling that the people want to consume always more. But when you scrutinize advertisement, the advertisements are not manipulating you based on this will to consume always more, but they are manipulating you based on what you are really looking for: more social interaction, more conviviality. And they pretend that you will reach this more social interaction, this friendship, with love, with conviviality. Why buying always more things? It's all this type of advertisement. Like if you have a MasterCard, you will have a fantastic relationship with your son. So it's how what's very important for human beings, what really matters, has been totally reappropriated. Why colonizing our imaginaries? Why manipulating our brains, our desires, and so on, through consumerism? And it works even more that you organize a society where, and in time of COVID, it's frightening, where you have less and less human interaction and conviviality and spaces for conviviality. So you consume as a palliative to the lack of conviviality and so on. But all the social, psychologically social, anthropological whatsoever studies are showing that the people are not interested in consuming always more, but are interested in a more frugal abundance with more and more meaningful and beautiful human interaction. And again, it's quite frightening, because if you look a lot of surveys made in the Western countries, the large majority of the people are against capitalism. The large majority of the people are not looking for always growth for growth, to produce more, to consume more, and so on and so on. The large majority of the people are tired or pissed off with their daily bullshit job. The large majority of the people are not happy with the rhythm of life and the rising stress, with how all the type of new screens and tools are always more in their life. Like you have a problem with the administration, you have to go online, you cannot go anymore to an office in your neighborhood when you know the person and you will talk and fix it and so on. And I can add a lot of examples like that. And I think there is a very large cultural potentialities for radical transformation of the society. And I really believe that what we experienced last year with the first confinement in last spring was very, very revealing for a lot of people in our society about what really matters. A lot of people confined at home with the children, cooking, trying to make home office, realize that their life, what was called normality, is nonsense. Is it enough to move on and to take the risk to go to freedom, to take the risk to go out of servitude volontaire, voluntary servitude? I don't know how to say in English. I'm not sure, but there is maybe like here an opportunity, because I really believe that the mindset of the people is more open than ever, and the situation is more radical than ever, political and so on situation. So it could be a political momentum, again, for the worse or also for very great things, and maybe for both.
Yeah, I think it's really important to know that one of the key planks of degrowth has always been to ban advertising. And I think that, yeah, that just that one thing in itself would create quite a change. There are lots and lots of questions.
Let's get on to questions.
Yeah. So there's, here in Italy, food producers are fighting against the CAP system. I'm not sure what that is.
Common agricultural policy.
Yes, of course.
It's one of those European bad things.
Yeah.
I mean, there's European bad things and there's like really bad English things. So I feel bad criticising even CAP. I mean, I think you can see, being English, my approach is just to be silent when asked anything. I have so little to give, sadly.
So it's talking about setting up autopoietic commons through commoning, and just pointing out that that communities don't have to be sort of co-located, that actually you can work across networks through digital methods and all that kind of thing. And perhaps that's a really important aspect to talk about in terms of degrowth, because we would see ourselves as very much oriented around open relocalization in terms of collective self-provisioning, but that the open part of relocalization is what keeps you open in those networks, so that, yes, we're using sorts of technologies and techniques and communications which are kind of good, and taking them through, as well as arguing for stronger local economies.
Shall I come in on some things? I think it's just
Definitely.
really, really important to be as absolute practical nuts and bolts as possible, because we all have many fine words, but fine words don't make revolution. And, I think what's really interesting, if people are getting these food commons in Italy, wouldn't it be really great to actually kind of sit down where people have done this successfully and say exactly what you do? I think we've got to have a very nuts and bolts approach. So one of the things I'm interested in is doing sort of publishing interviews on like practice, whether it's you've had the spy cops in and how you resist repression. Lenin famously said, if you've got spies in, you get them working. And as a friend of mine who was a revolutionary in the 70s, they had a cop, so they got him doing all the washing up and the food preparation. Something slightly facetious, but we've got to really kind of get this as absolutely practical as possible. And really, if people have got these food commons, it would be so good to kind of learn more about them and say, what exactly do you do? How can we replicate this? What works? What doesn't work? I mean, that's the Austrian approach, is you don't have like a grand vision of how wonderful and lovely everything would be, but you look at where people are doing practical stuff, which is really revolutionary, and then you see what works, what fails, whether other people can learn from it. So the food commons in Italy sounds great.
Yeah, well, that's right.
Nuts and bolts.
That's exactly right. So that's what the Food for Degrowth collection is about. And there are over 30 contributors. And there are just massively interesting things happening on the ground. And Vincent himself is involved in that. So maybe you talk about your practical everyday degrowth activities.
I've been talking quite a lot since then, so maybe we can get to the next question.
But I think it would be good to
now
just
maybe
to
a few words, yeah, but it's only one example. I would say I totally agree with Derek that we have to be very practical and pedagogical and to share the information to the right people in the right way at the right time. To be honest, I have the chance to be involved in such alternatives, and there are millions of wonderful alternatives all around the world, full of creativity, full of good sense, full of a great solution, and so on. And based on my experience, and also I had the opportunity in the last year to travel quite a lot in Europe and visit a lot of this type of cooperative and so on. The biggest challenge is not so much technical. It's really about human interaction. I mean, the human, as we say in French, the fucking human factor, the precious, wonderful human factor. And it's really about that. And also the second one, and we could do what we do now in Budapest. In the time we did it, and if we have to start it now, it would be impossible, because Budapest was still a city full of commons, was still a city full of places which were type of alternative social centers where you could reappropriate these spaces to bring your own project, to open a debate, to connect with people, and so on. And nowadays, with the commodification of life in Budapest, with mass tourism, with economic development and this type of things, it will be much more difficult to start what we started 10 years ago. And what we have is just a typical community supportive agriculture with a local farm connected to urban gardening. And also, we have a logistics center in the city center of Budapest with cargo bikes, what we self-construct ourselves. And we distribute our vegetable boxes with our cargo bikes. And all around these activities, we develop a lot of those type of activities like low tech, like ecofeminism, like care, like the commons. We have research projects, we have educational projects when we go to school or we involve children and all this type of things. But I would say that everywhere in every city, if you take time to look, you will find type of organization like ours with people who are privileged enough and maybe also crazy enough to quit the dominant system and to start to experiment what could be a degrowth model of society, or call it as you want. And what I love, and which is also one of the biggest challenge, that it works pretty well till you stay small scale. And us, we designed it in the beginning that we will never grow, but we don't grow, but we work on the quality, we work on the autonomy, we work on the enjoyment of life within the cooperation, the cooperative. And to find the balance, we use the small scale cooperative when we enjoy a lot as a pilot project to influence other people. So we regularly welcome visitors, we host workshops, we welcome trainees for long term and so on, and we try to share our experience after up to the people to think that we are simply crazy and there is nothing to learn with us, or to take what they can take and to bring it home. And usually based on our experience, the people, they bring it home, and when they're back home, they also self-construct their own project. And I think that we should develop this idea, what I call a horizontal scale-up of this type of initiative, that all these initiatives shouldn't grow individually, but should replicate a bit everywhere in the logic of open relocalization, decentralization, self-organization, and so on. And the precursors like us, who are quite privileged, I think we have an important role to play to first show that alternatives are existing, to give confidence to the people who are thinking about doing something similar, that, yeah, it's sometimes very tough to handle and to implement. You have to be crazy. Sometimes you have to work a lot and so on, but it's worth trying because it's a lot of enjoyment of life. It's a lot of self-esteem. It's a lot of When you go home after spending a tough day at the farm, you're the happiest ever, even if your back is painful more than ever, or your skin is burnt more than ever, and whatsoever, you've been freezing like nowadays in the winter and so on. So it's worth taking the risk to go out of voluntary servitude, to go out of your bullshit job and to experiment something. And also it's very important to feel that you are connected to a network, that usually this type of initiatives are all connected to network. You have a lot of informal, formal type of solidarities all around. And what we do with Cargonomia in Budapest wouldn't be possible if we didn't have from the beginning a large network that we could construct, because we had these alternative bars and nightlife in Budapest, which was like based on the logic of the commons, where we could meet and create friendship and solidarity with a lot of people. So again, you need spaces to connect with each other and to create this type of informal solidarities.
Did you want to speak, Derek, or will I go?
Are there more questions? You said there were lots of questions.
Well, you know what? This is a very good example. We've got questions and we've got answers. So
okay, well, that's good.
it is brilliant grassroots action amongst people participating. So there are a few extra questions, but one thing that I'd just like to point out in terms of the discussion that we've just been having is that I've found in my life that working part-time has been really important. And now I have the luxury of being semi-retired. I say semi only because I'm really retired from paid work, although I occasionally get paid work. But, you know, like basically I'm working frantically all the time, but just not on paid things. And it's a wonderful liberation in terms of giving you space to discuss with other people what are possibilities for you to do with your spare time, to relax, to give yourself some distance from the actual daily reality. And I understand that again, this is a kind of privilege if you actually can live on a part-time salary. Although when we're talking about degrowth, then we're also, you can actually hear cockatoos, I think, in the background. When we're talking about degrowth, it's also a bit of a discipline just in terms of living on less as well. So I think that that's a kind of a really practical kind of strategy. Another question is, would anyone like to speak further on the risks that people would face in to go I'm not sure that I really understand the question in terms of freedom, but how much this requires the base groups to be showing alternatives. I think it's really basically, if we're going to be sort of working towards this kind of freedom in our everyday practical lives as well as decision making, how much, what actually base groups need to be doing. I suppose in a great sense, it's showing those alternatives. I have to shut the door.
So Derek, you want to go on that?
I'm not entirely clear about the question, but maybe, you know, if we need to come up with a kind of social change, it's going to involve a lot of resistance and a lot of struggles. And you have to build communities of resistance, and you have to draw people in, you have to get all the people skills right. So quite often you have like revolutionary organizations and there's all sorts of arguments and splits and ego and sectarianism. And it's certainly no solution to say, oh, we'll be nice and non-hierarchical and non-sectarian. You know, you've got to do really hard work on group dynamics and what works and what doesn't work. But wow, you've got to really, to build the base is ultimately a community of militants. So you've got to kind of get more and more people in. You've got to deepen people's commitment and political education, so that you've got really a very strong basis for change. And, things are not great in Britain. I'm very conscious where I've got comrades in the States and all the absolute appalling disaster in Texas. We know, don't we, that we've got COVID, climate change, we've got more and more disasters. And then there's sort of gaslighting saying, oh, it's not climate change which is the solution. There's renewable energy and it isn't working, and that's why you're freezing to death. So, right around the world, but particularly in the States, things are so oppressive and so many people are being killed that actually building the base, having a strong community of militants and having the mutual aid, is increasingly survival. So I don't know if that's got anything in answer to the question. Things are not brilliant in Britain. They're much worse in the States. Right around the world, there's repression. And I don't know whether we're ever going to get freedom. I don't know whether freedom exists, but just not to die of COVID and people not freezing to death in like Austin. You've got to build really strong communities, really get people involved. It's increasingly a matter of survival.
Yeah, I think an allied question was around thoughts or examples of effective resistance protest against the constraints of COVID restrictions and lockdown. In the same fireworks series that Exploring Degrowth has come out of, in June last year, the very first book in the series is called Pandemic Solidarity. So it's another Pluto Press book. Grab that. That has got 18 chapters, and some of them cover more than one country or case studies. And it's all about how people have acted in solidarity, both in meeting their material and other like health needs within the COVID crisis. That's
come back on this? I mean, it's not great in Britain. There's like protest movements trying to get the government to relax what they're doing. We've had like this really incompetent government. They've not really got control of the situation with COVID. They went into lockdown very late. 120,000 of our loved ones have died. And there are movements saying, we need really to relax this. Don't worry about COVID. People die all the time. And that's only a very small minority of people, but it's so scary in Britain that, you've not really got movements where people are saying, my God, look at Australia or China or Vietnam or Taiwan or Iceland or all the countries where they've crushed COVID. Why have our government failed this? There's actually a sort of discourse of denial. So very, very worrying. I mean, I think there are some positive things. I'd say mutual aid can be a cop-out and a sticking plaster and get away from the failures of government. But, you've got groups like Oxford Mutual Aid, who I think are, feeding thousands of people every week, very organised. So there's some really inspiring stuff out there.
Yeah, the pandemic solidarity is coming out of the radical mutual aid movement and, includes what Kurds have been doing, and it's actually really inspiring. It's not about resisting government restrictions. It's about how do you cope with the fact that the government isn't providing for all kinds of disadvantaged groups, prisoners, homeless people, all of that kind of thing. And it is about actually working together and, in a sense, creating a parallel society to make up for those gaps. So
I was just going to come back on something else. I'm not really keeping hold of the chat, but I noticed somebody had said in Ireland the sort of COVID denial is being led by the far right. And I don't absolutely share all of their politics. I was going to say one really great thing in Ireland is the Connolly Youth Brigade. So they're inspired by James Connolly, who was Ireland's finest revolutionary. And they do, lots of practical mutual aid, revolutionary action, really important. So, certainly in Ireland, in like Britain, you've got, right-wing forces kind of manipulating, kind of COVID denial. But, there are some very good alternatives as well, like Connolly Youth Brigade.
Dagmar also brings up about farmers who are criminalised by setting up alternative kind of policies. And it's not just farmers. If you're working in the areas of housing and other kinds of areas as well, what you very quickly find is that planning, building regulations, in this instance, like food regulations, all of the taxation systems that require people to run their accounts in particular kinds of ways, all of these structures are, if not criminalising, crippling ways forward for people. And I think those are really good points to bring up, but it's exactly why alternative systems so often run under the radar or whatever, and we shouldn't have to run under the radar. We should be out there, and these should be ways in which people are allowed to live. If we live within freedom, within liberal democracies or whatever, we should be able to do these kinds of things.
I mean, you might have this in Australia, but I don't think we've ever had liberal democracy in Britain. I think it's a very thin version. But
no, we don't. But that's what they're running. That's what they're running as their line. So you keep them at their word, kind of thing on that. Yeah, no, it's not. It's not. It's the exact reverse of that. As a lot of our discussion shows, there's a lot of rigidity in the system, which really stops us doing very, very ordinary and simple things. There's a question about, do you think those in the so-called global south can increase living standards with degrowth? Also, what would degrowth look like in national policies, or do you focus mostly on local communities implementing degrowth? And I'll just say one thing before both of you speak, and that is in terms of the global south, there are some particular websites you might want to have a look at. One of them's called Radical Ecological Democracy. And Ashish Kothari, who's a degrowth advocate living in India, is also involved with global tapestries movement. And so if you check out those things online, you'll be able to, I suppose the way that the degrowth movement works is this. Number one, we have a first principle of decreasing inequalities. And in terms of the global south people speak for their needs and wants. And so we've got various people in the movement, and a few years ago had a conference in Mexico which was specifically on these kinds of issues. And if you go to degrowth.info, which is kind of international site for degrowth, you'll be able to find papers from that conference. One thing I thought, Vincent, it would be really good to get in now, because we're probably going to have to wind up in 10 minutes or so, is about the degrowth conferences we've got coming up for the rest of this year.
Yeah, just I want to reflect a bit more about the question of so-called global south. I think it's very important to go back to history of degrowth when you speak about that, because it was really the meeting of two groups of people. The first group was adbuster activists, and it's very important, and we already spoken about that. And advertisement is really one of the key problems for society, which is totally manipulating our brains and so on. And when I was involved in Extinction Rebellion networks, I was always fighting to go to destroy advertisement, in particular a lot of illegal advertisements which are aggressing us everywhere. But the second group of people was a radical group of academics from Global South and Global North, which were critical with development, and development as Western imperialistic tool to keep on going with colonization. And one of the founding events of degrowth was really in 2002 in Paris at UNESCO, under the name Deconstruct Development, Rebuild the World. And towards that, and that's why I use this expression also, decolonize our imaginary, because degrowth is really about decolonization and to understand the role of colonization for how we created our illusion of material comfort in the Western societies. I mean, we wouldn't be able to have such a high level of comfort and such a ecological footprint, which is about 3, 4, 5, 6 planets, if we didn't go to steal all the resources in Global South and also exploit the people. And with that, also to quote Aminata Traoré, who was the Minister of Culture in Mali, to colonize their imaginary, to rape their imaginary with our Western development imperialistic approach. And it was very important for Anitra and me when we launched the book Exploring Degrowth to do it with Ashish Kotari, what you mentioned, and to connect with the Global South people. Because it's not about making them richer. It's not about bringing development to Global South. It's even less about bringing degrowth in Global South, because they don't need degrowth. It's more about to degrow in the Global North and offer them the possibility in the South to reappropriate self-determination. What they will do with that self-determination, it's up to them. But it's not to tell them follow the same tracks than us, but invent your world and so on. I forgot the point you want. Yeah, and saying that, we have every 2 years, and nowadays every year, International Degrowth Conference. So we have the international ones and parallel ones, which are more thematic. So you mentioned the one in Mexico City in 2018, which was really about decolonization of imaginary and Global North, Global South dialogue, where a lot of a group of indigenous people, particularly from Andes, participated actively in that conference, in the organization, and so on. We are now the people sitting on the lithium mine and experts from their land to implement the ecological transition in Global North. So it's another part of the debate. And we were supposed to have the 7th International Degrowth Conference last year in September in Manchester. Unfortunately, we could only organize an online symposium, which was, I think, very great. So you can find the videos of it. And in that symposium, there were a lot of debates about Global North, Global South dialogue as well. And it was a conference co-organized with the International Society of Ecological Economics, which is a society of academics, which are quite interdisciplinary and quite close to degrowth and very critical with the dominant system. So this conference is postponed to July. Unfortunately, and Derek spoke a lot about the situation in UK. The conference will only be online. And to be honest, each time I have a meeting with the local organizing committee in Manchester, I want to cry, because the situation in UK is really frightening. And what they face at the University of Manchester and all around Manchester, it's really a tragedy. So we cannot organize a normal conference, and it's really a pity, because I think I had the opportunity to spend some time in Manchester to prepare the conference, and I could connect with a lot of local activist group and local initiative, which were really wonderful. And the idea when we make this conference is to have something academic and political, but also to embed it into network of activists and so on. So Manchester, unfortunately, will be online in beginning of July. And we will have another conference, but we try to maintain face-to-face. I really believe that even if we have the pandemics and we have to be careful, being smart with social distancing and so on, it's very important to keep conviviality and face-to-face interaction. It will be in The Hague in the end of the summer, in end of August. And you can find all the information on degrowth.info.
I could maybe just briefly say some things. I mean, I think in some ways I don't quite identify with the degrowth movement. I'm passionate about degrowth, but I think there are a whole number of things that articulate and fit together. So, you know, it's the 150th anniversary of the Paris Commune, and people can get together, make change, but get heavily repressed. And really to sort of echo what we've been saying, this kind of blind accumulation and growth and consumption and production and waste and poverty and oppression is a product of capitalism, and we need to transcend capitalism. So, you know, that means some sort of ecological communism that works. So really, I would kind of emphasize, you know, do the work in the community, reach out to people, do practical work that people can see. It's another group which is great, Valleys Underground in South Wales, and there's a lot of poverty, the industrialisation, the mines have gone, and maybe in some ways it's good the coal's not there, but very, very poor communities. And they organise, you know, supporting the community. And when people are not locked down, they go out and clear allotments. There was a disused synagogue in the valleys, which they've been cleaning up. And they say, well, if people see us as revolutionary socialists actually doing something, it draws people in. So I'm a little bit of a monomaniac on this. It's like capitalism is the problem. We need a different economic system. So we need to go back and read our Marx. You know, and how do we actually overthrow the system? And to me, it's the sort of slogan of build the base, serve the people, and look at that community militancy. I hope you don't mind me hijacking your book and going on about my stuff.
Degrowth is very much about engaging with other people. This is another book that came out last year, Degrowth in Movements, and really illustrates the extent to which degrowth is engaged with other movements. This is for us, this is very important, and it's what we want to do, not, yeah. So that's good, welcome.
Yeah, in our book, Exploring Degrowth, what I invite everybody to buy at this Housmans bookshop. And to be honest, it's a bit hard not to be at the bookshop together and not to have the pint of beer after in London. I would have enjoyed that so much, and to be all together and to debate and to be in my office again in front of this dystopic screen and speak on Zoom and so on. So it's a bit sad. But in Exploring Degrowth, and buy it in Housmans bookshop to support this type of local bookshop, which are fantastic. We have a part when we reflect on Marx and eco-socialism and so on. And in particular, we go back to a part of the debates which were happening in the second part of the 19th century between Marx and utopian socialism and maybe a social anarchism and so on. And in particular, I invite everybody to go back to the fantastic book of Paul Lafargue, who was the son-in-law of Marx.
The Right to Be Lazy.
Interaction, The Right to Be Lazy. So it's going to be time for us to get the right to be lazy, and I wish everybody a very good night.
Yeah, and in case it appeared otherwise, I actually identify as an eco-socialist as well as the degrowth person.
That was the book where Marx says, "Je ne sais pas Marxist." I think we've got to stop being lazy and get busy. I know whose side I'm on in that debate. But well, should we let people enjoy their mornings in Australia? Let you go off and have your breakfast?
It's Saturday morning because we're ahead of you. So
yeah,
it's
that's what I'm saying.
It's the Right to Be Lazy Day.
Well, you've got up at 5:30. What's it? 5 o'clock in the morning, your time. Whoa!
You have more time to be lazy from now on.
Indeed.
I mean, I'm a completely driven fanatic, but I'm going to leave. Watch my Picard Star Trek and have a beer. I suppose in deference to Degrowth, I'll have one of my own beers I've made rather than the something
Good
else. All right, shall we wrap things up?
So thanks a lot. Thanks, Derek.
Thank you,
Thanks,
everyone.
Housman Bookshop. Thanks, Anitra. Have a good night. Bye-bye.
Just like build the base, serve the people. Bye.